Hello, my name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office Development. This module is Microsoft Teams Apps Advanced Techniques. This module has three sections: Advanced Teams Bot Capabilities, Compose Extensions, and Teams Apps with multiple capabilities. If you're just getting started with Microsoft Teams Apps, there is a different module that covers the fundamentals. The first section, Advanced Teams Bot Capabilities, will discuss the Teams Bot extension library and how you can use it to respond to events, update messages, cards, dialogues, and so on. It will show several demos of these capabilities in action. The Teams Bot Extensions is a library available for both NuGet and NPM that helps parse the activity object that gets passed back and forth into system events and member and channel information, and some helper methods to process the attachments, and more importantly, a rich data model for the various objects that could be passed back and forth. It also includes a sample tenant filtering attribute you can use to restrict your bot to certain tenants. For example, if you work at an ISV and you want to sell this to different tenants. Responding to events is the first item we'll cover here. The idea here is that your bot can then be aware of changes happening to group membership or when the bot is invoked from a one-on-one conversation. And responding to these events makes you proactive. It encourages people to interact with your bot. As you can see from the table, we have the various event types that we related to Microsoft Teams. Obviously, the members added and removed, and information about the channels. You'll notice there are some that are available into the Bot Framework SDK, don't necessarily support it in Teams, and so you won't just be able to react to those. But the rest of them are handled pretty well. So the first thing I want to show you is go to a demo that will show how we can respond to events. In this demo, we're going to see how a bot can interrogate the team membership and send one-on-one messages. We're doing this in response to the bot being added to a team. So in the Microsoft Teams app, I've logged in as Paul. Paul's a member of the advanced team. In the web browser, I've logged in as Stanley, and Stanley's also a member of the advanced team. Using the techniques we learned in the previous module, I'm going to sideload the bot. And as the bot is added to the advanced team, it will then send a message to each of those. You can see here that the Teams bot 2 has been added card bots. If I look at this toast messages from the Microsoft Teams app to Paul, I'll click in the chat window for Paul, and we'll see this is the welcome message. The advanced team has cardbot, which is the name I gave my bot. But also notice in the web browser that Stanley also got in a chat alert. If I click on that as well, you'll see that the Teams bot 2 also reached out to Stanley with the same message. So let's see how this is accomplished. This bot has been extended using the Microsoft Teams extensions. If I go to the Package Managed Library Console, you can see by installing the NuGet package called Microsoft.bot.connector.teams, it adds this additional information to the bot library. The messages controller has been changed a little bit from the out-of-the-box bot framework wizard. Again, we're checking the message to see if it's the activity type, to see if it's a message or a conversation. If it's a message, we can do some type of reply. Otherwise, it's a system message of some sort. And in this handle system message method is where we start seeing some of the team specific information. Right? So by getting the conversation update data, this is an extension method added to my activity, which gets me information about the team, the event that happened inside a Microsoft team, such as what type. And so you can see here, this event data object has an enumeration of the various event types, allowing me to just simply do a switch statement to handle those. In this particular code, I'm only handling a single event, but all of them are available to you. When a team member is added, we connect up to the service, right? So we get this information, we connect back to the connector client, we set some retry policies, which is optional information, but available, which would be helpful. The message does provide information about the team that's being added. I get the tenant ID and the account of my bot and information about the channel. And what we care about here is the channel data. And so by using the channel data, I can then get the conversation members of a channel. In this particular example, we're getting the list of members, converting them to what we call a Teams accounts, and then looping through each one and sending a one-on-one message. Sending a one-on-one message is pretty straightforward. We just build our string, and we can do a response back to that conversation. The key difference here is that the member being added is passed in, is checked in here. We have the ability to check to see, is the message, the recipient of the activity is going to be the bot, and we check to see in the particular member that we that was added in the event data, was that the same as the person who was the bot. So it's easy enough for us to see if the bot has been added, then I want to enumerate all of the members of the team and send them a one-on-one message. Pretty straightforward. Next, we want to talk about advanced messaging features. When we're using a bot to bring information from our external systems into Microsoft Teams, it's helpful for users to understand that this information is up to date. And so when a bot sends a message to a channel or to a one-on-one conversation, the bot extension library allows us to update that message at a future time. If something changes, we can send an update to keep the current state. As you're thinking through how to do your messaging, you want to be proactive in your channels or your conversations, right? So if something changes in the service that users need to do, you should proactively alert them about that. Again, either by updating a message or creating a new one. But it's a fine balance. We don't necessarily want to be alerting and flooding the channel with all types of information. We want to be helpful, not noisy. And this ability to update an existing message helps us to do that. We can just show the current state without having to flood them with alerts. As we want our users to interact with our bot, there are various things that we should consider. First of all, is we have this dialogue example. Right? So the bot framework includes this concept of a dialogue, and it starts with one dialogue at the top, typically called the root dialogue, and some type of message is sent to the root dialogue, and it can either handle the message directly or it can pass it along to some other dialogue, adding that one to the stack. And so the one at the top of the stack is going to get the message, and it can decide how to respond. If it can't respond to it, it can then pass that to another one, putting itself lower in the stack. It can leave the stack if it wants. It can process the response and return data back to its caller. And so in this method, we can make it easier for developers to have a single-use dialogue, but the user doesn't have to understand that there's many dialogues in the back. He's just interacting with the bot, making a conversation. There is a concept of a scorable dialogue, which we consider kind of like an HTTP handler. Certain keywords or certain messages can always be handled by a certain type of dialogue that's available, even if it's not the top one on the stack. There is a built-in dialogue called a prompt dialogue, and we can, in our code, declare the possible choices and invoke the prompt dialogue. And the prompt dialogue retains the focus or the top of the stack until a valid value is selected. Now, that could be rather frustrating if I continually enter the wrong value and the bot says, nope, try again, try again, try again. So you certainly want to have the option to say, quit the dialogue or just limit to the number of attempts. But that will also let users guide them to pick which one do you really wish to invoke. And lastly, we can provide a menu. This is a team-specific bot implementation in which I can, in my manifest, declare a bunch of options that I want to show in a menu. And then when users invoke my bot, we can show them a menu of things that we can do. So rather than being frustrating and having to understand what my bot understands, I get a menu of choices. Again, this is not more the natural language processing, but it certainly can be helpful if there's a specific set of options that you can support and want to do that helps people. It can guide them. But you want to keep it short and simple. We don't want to take up a whole full screen. Again, it's just a little prompt inside a dialogue. So let's move on now to a demo to discuss some of these advanced features. So at the beginning of this demo, we'll talk about updating a card based on updated information. In this example, you see there's a snippet of code that is showing us replying, just echoing what was sent. You sent a certain amount of text, which is so many different characters. And if we run this inside a channel, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a bug. So I'm going to mention the team bot, and we'll just do hello world. And hello world, as you can see, is 11 characters. And if I press enter, you'll notice it comes back right away saying it's 32 characters, which seems kind of crazy at first, right? But then you'll notice after a few seconds, we say, actually removing the mention, it was 11 characters. And so this is a contrived example I granted, but it shows the ability for us to come back and update a card after the fact. So in this particular example, we just echo the value, but the actual text that gets replied or gets sent to is rich text. It has HTML, it has the mention. And that extensions library lets us call this extension method. This of course being the Microsoft the bot.connector.teams extension library lets us extract the text without any mentions in it, and we'll know what the actual value was. So that lets us do this little update activity to say, here's the updated information. In addition, we get some rich text, rich objects for managing cards. And so in this particular example, I want to show off a little bit of the cards. So if the text that we actually are sent back into our bot contains the word card, we're going to invoke this cards dialog. Right? So showing this real quick here, if I come in here and we again invoke our team bot, and we just type in card, we'll run, and you'll see we notice we don't get the word count in this particular example. We're getting a different message about not supporting a type of card. I'm going to go to the cards. So the way this is handled in the bot framework is if the message that we're looking for contains a certain keyword, we're going to forward this response to a child dialog. And this child dialog is the cards dialog. And if I look in the cards dialog, it's looking for either hero card or thumbnail card. And if it receives one of those, it will respond with that card. Otherwise, it replies with the I don't understand. So this display selected card, which is going to then create what we're looking for. If I scroll down here, we have little helper methods. And in this particular example here, you see we have a hero card object and a thumbnail card object. These again are in the Teams extensions for the bot framework that lets me just have properties that build those out. So knowing now what type we're expecting to see, let me invoke this again. And this time we'll send the hero card. If I show a hero card, you'll see that I get the full screen, well not full screen, but a rather large image. The other option, of course, is a thumbnail card. So if I invoke it here, and you'll notice, wait, oh, I have a typo, right? So if I get this correct, and then you'll see the thumbnail card, which is a little bit smaller image. Oops, and see, I forgot to mention. So you can see it can be somewhat difficult to get this out, frustrating if you will, right? We don't want, this is not necessarily an optimal experience that we want for our end users, right? And so what's the best approach to that? We can do what we call this command set to do a little menu, right? So I should point out, sorry to follow this up here. If you'll notice here, when I'm doing a response here, I'm still doing a reply. I'm posting a reply. Here's my example where I'm just replying a text, right? But I can also just reply with the message that has an attachment. And so the card, if I scroll down here and you'll see I get the hero card, this is going to return an attachment object. And the attachment object then gets, here you'll see the attachment object gets added to my message. So the message has text, the message can actually have an attachment. And so cards are an attachment to a message. So next I want to, we talked in the slide deck a little bit about giving a little menu about things that we can show, give people, hey, these are the options that happen for us. And so that is defined in manifest.js. And under the bot section of the manifest, I have a set of command lists. And I can define whether a command applies to a team scope or a personal scope. And here's a list of commands. And you'll see I've added those. But you've not seen this anywhere. Where does this menu show up? What's happening here is that I change the manifest. And when I change the manifest, I need to provide that updated manifest to Microsoft Teams. So I simply need to navigate to my team apps again and redo the side-loaded image. And I'm just going to pick the same one. If you know it's already existing, I'll just upload it a second time. As it does its processing, it really didn't do much difference here. I don't see any physical difference. Nothing's happened, no confirmation message. However, if I come back in now to the conversation and I do @teams, as soon as I invoke and choose @teamsbot, it says, what can I say? And if I choose this, you'll see it says I can say hero card or thumbnail card. And when I click on this, it will actually inject the correct string for me. And if I look here in my command list, I have the description and a title. And this title is actually what's injected into the card. So now when I go through and run this, I get thumbnail card, I see my thumbnail, and I don't have to worry about misspelling. If I know that this command menu is going to show up and I don't see it as I'm typing, so as I was talking before, where it's like, well, where's my little menu? It's a little indicator. I don't see the menu until I reference the bot. So then when I choose the bot, that's where it shows up again. So it's a little bit of tips that I can give to my users to say, help get me on the right path and reduce frustration. So now that you've seen these advanced techniques in action, I want to stop the debugger and dive a little bit further into the whole dialogue concept to make sure this is clear. As we say, we have this root dialogue is where things start. So when our messages controller invokes the root dialogue, right? So if we know that we have some type of message, not a system message, but an actual person typing in a conversation, we start by invoking our root dialogue, right? So we're sending a response, and the response is whatever the root dialogue gives back to us. And the root dialogue is where we have some initial text to see what is it values that we're getting. Do we want to handle the word ping explicitly? Do we want to handle the word card explicitly? We want to just do something else, right? And in card is where we have this. We say, hey, if there's some type of card, I don't want to put all that code in my root dialogue. I want to have a specific object or specific class that will handle all types of cards. And so I'm forwarding the context from the root dialogue to a child dialogue called the cards dialogue. And when the cards dialog is done, I want to resume with this method. And then, of course, I pass some data to the card dialog, which is the activity. And if I want to cancel it later, this is your typical asynchronous cancelization. But this resume after cards dialog, you'll see has a very simple thing. It just waits for the next message. And so what we're doing here is we're simply saying, hey, if when the message comes in, I handle it and then I wait for the next one, right? So as I create a new dialogue, the new root dialogue, you'll see I simply wait for a message. And when a message is received, I call the message async method. That method processes the message. Either it responds directly or it forwards to the cards dialog. And in either event, it then waits again. So it's continually waiting for a message to come in. This is the proper approach that you'd want to do, is do your activity and then wait for another incoming message. As I mentioned, we're forwarding the context to the cards dialog. So let's look at the cards dialog in depth. The cards dialog, as part of its constructor, does the same thing. It just waits for an incoming message. And I mentioned during the slides that there's a stack of dialogues that are maintained by the bot framework. So when I forward the context from root to cards dialog is now at the top. So any message that is typed in, the initial message is passed into it as part of that call, but then it can also wait for incoming messages as well. So the context is forward, the word card was forwarded in here, and now you'll notice a similar pattern. I can now look at the message and handle this as I wish. Again, we're just doing a little if statement to say I want to do this. Now, if you're adding natural language processing using Lewis or some other form, that's a different paradigm. But in this initial bot framework, Microsoft Teams extended bot framework at Bot Builder SDK example, this is how we're doing these things, right? And in my example, this may be okay because I'm providing a menu and I don't necessarily need to apply natural language processing. So I'm, again, looking at the message and responding. Now, the key thing to note in here, I don't do it in this particular example, but we can right here when we say, after we get a card, I can either reply that I don't know what kind of card that is, or I actually reply with a specific card. I specify context.done. That tells the bot framework that the cards dialog is finished. I can return back to the root dialog. If I didn't tell it I was done, and then, for example, I typing any message, it would do the echo. If I didn't do context.done, the next message would come in and be routed to the card dialog, which is looking for a type of card to display. And that's where you would get into the case of, I don't understand this type of card. I understand this type of card. So there might actually be a little bug in here that says maybe we should only allow this to happen 1 or 2 times before the user says, hey, get me out of here. I don't know what to do. But in this particular example, because I'm replying, if I don't know what you asked me, I'm saying done, I'm getting myself off the stack, and then it falls back to my root dialog, which again handles all these types of things. And again, if I do display a selected card, I am also doing context.done, right? So I post the message and then this context.done. So in actuality, what happens when context.done returns back to the root dialog, I can get this the result here. I don't do anything with the result, but that when I do context.done, whatever object I pass in that method gets returned to this callback. So I could, in theory, remember that information, store it in state. My example doesn't do that. But this is a concept that we want to apply when we're using dialogues. I can separate the handling of a certain type of message in a certain class, and then just chain these together as appropriate, and work on it. And I can still apply natural language processing if I'm going to be using the Lewis service to read what people have said and map that to that intent, that utterance example into a specific intent. I can then route that to a specific dialogue. So you can build all these pieces together to get a really complex bot. So moving on now to section 2 of this module, compose extensions. We'll discuss what compose extensions are, what their intention, dives deep into all the specifics of how it works, and of course continue with a demo. So compose extensions are the ability for us to share some content in a chat or in a channel. And the idea behind a compose extension is that a user wants to show some information from an application, or from your application, if you will. And how do I get that in there? I can switch contexts, open the application, take a screenshot, copy paste, or select the text and paste it in there. But if we can make it easy for users to search our application right in line in their chat, they can find the information that they want and add that as a card to the message and immediately post it in there. So now I have information about my app, easily accessible, can be put into a conversation by a particular user, and again, the conversation happens around that chat. Now there are other ways to accomplish the same type of thing. We talked earlier about how we could deep link in a tab or have something on a tab inject a thing, and we'll talk about webhooks and connectors in the next section. But this is just one other approach. If a user is in a chat and wants to look up information in your application, they can do so right in line. There is the ability to customize the display of entities once we do that. So you see in the right hand side of this slide, there's a search box at the top, and then you have a bunch of information that can pick or choose one of those types of things. Again, this is you can define this information as a card. You decide what to show based on the response, create a card. Microsoft Teams handles the rendering. When they click on one of the cards, it automatically submits that card as a message in the conversation. That's all happened by the Teams application. So, as we said, a Teams user is doing some type of query using the Teams platform. The Teams platform will then broker that request through the bot framework to your service, which is a compose extension. So we're leveraging the bot framework to call into this cloud-hosted service to get the information. So typically you would add a compose extension to a bot. In the demo, we'll add it to the existing bot. Perhaps you want a separate one to do the information, because as I'm doing this custom compose extension, I'm not interacting with the bot framework to do types of dialogues, for example. I'm just calling a method and getting a response back. But you'll see some common programming practices to generate a card, so it makes sense to put them all together. But in any event, the compose extension will extend the compose window. It provides information for them to select what information they want. Okay? And again, because it's built on the bot framework, I get activities coming back and forth to my service, and I can handle it appropriately. Again, we have this bit for both .NET and Node.js to help you do work just as you'd expect with the Bot Builder SDK. You define a compose extension in the manifest. Right? So the compose extension, again, associated with a bot, you have to put in your bot ID. You define, is it work, what scope, and if remember, scopes are either personal or team, so a one-on-one chat or a channel conversation. And then you have, you define a command. And the command lets me say at the very top, what do I want to have happen? I can have multiple commands as well, but the example is I want to have a command that has an ID, and the command has a set of parameters, and parameters actually have names. And for every parameter, I will get some type of input control in the Teams application. The user completes input control, they submit it, posted back to your service is the command ID, a parameter name, and a parameter values. Right, so you're defining in the manifest what you want the combination to be. Updating the manifest means I'll have to re-sideload my application to make it take effect, which we've done that. We understand how that works. In addition, the compose extensions are play alongside with others. And in the middle of the slide, you'll see here that the YouTube has a compose extension, Visual Studio has a compose extension, and your sample at bot template can have one as well. And they're all shown together. All the registered compose extensions in a given channel are shown at the same time. As I mentioned, you define a command in your manifest, right? And so here are the parameters or the properties that you need to specify for your command. Every command has a unique ID, right? And the idea here is that when the activity message is posted to your method, you get a command ID, and you should know with this ID how to act on it, right? The title is what we show in the UI. The description again shows in the UI, right? Initial run is a flag that says, "Hey, when I first invoke the compose extension, do I want to make a call?" So you can imagine that I'm making a call with my parameters set to their default values. So do you want to pre-populate a list of items, or do you want to have user do input first before you populate items? So initial run set to true means it's going to make a call with a default value for your, actually with the null value for your parameters, and you would execute based on defaults. And then for a list of parameters, you describe the name of it. You get the parameter names back in your call. You can give it a description, and of course a title, which is a short, user-friendly information. And again, the value, it doesn't say this in the slide, but you don't define the value in the manifest, but at runtime you do get the value. When the compose extension is invoked and submitted, an activity is posted to your bot framework method. The activity type, we've seen activity types of messages. Now we have a new activity type called invoke. So an activity type of invoke means that it's a compose extension. And then the activity name is going to have 3 different variables. It's either query or a query setting URL or actually doing a setting. And so all of these, these are different types of things that you can handle. This is what's sent to your endpoint of your bot. And when you use the Teams connector for the Bot Builder SDK, it will help detect these and give you it will detect invoke versus message. It'll invoke the time of the event and call the appropriate method for you. So using the extensions makes it much simpler. As you saw in the previous slide, there's different types. Those are surfaced as events, right? So you get a query event. Right? And so the query event would show up to your data as a get compose extension query data. And you are passed the command ID and list of parameters. Right? And so you would then verify those command ID to make sure you understand it, make sure the parameters are valid. If everything is valid, you can then use those values passed as part of the parameters and do a query to some service. And the results from your service are then returned back to Microsoft Teams, just sending a message as we've done before, and you would typically have a list, right? The attachment layout called list, and list items are either hero cards or thumbnail cards or Office 365 connector cards, whatever is appropriate for to surface the data in your service. So that is the query event. There's also a settings event, right? So when I define the manifest, I can say, does this bot have a configuration option? And if that is set to true, you'll notice in the little picture there is the ability to invoke a settings method. And when we do a settings method, that is when I get this onQuery settings URL type. And the expectation here is that you would return a URL of a page. Teams will then render that page, similar to what we saw for tabs configuration. The teams will render that page. The expectation is user would configure it and click a submit button of some sort. When they do that, the Teams client then calls to your bot, passing the invoke option again, but this time it's on settings update, and then you can then pull the information from the configuration and you store that somewhere. Now that storage is your responsibility, right? So you want to, if it's a per user setting, you want to make sure you understand the user who's invoking it. If it's a team or per channel setting, you want to make sure you grab that information. Again, it's up to you, but you can customize that as well if there, for some reason, you want to have some type of settings, right? So I'm going to go back in the slides for a little bit. If you here saw the name of the type of event, we have the query, we have the query settings, URL, and actually the settings. So those are the different types that can be spent, and they're exposed in through the updated SDK with these various event names. Other things that you need to consider when you're doing this, right? So these calls are not necessarily authenticated, right? We're just getting a bot framework call, right? And that bot framework, there's some authentication between your bot service and the bot registration portal and Microsoft Teams, right? But when I get in the payload from an activity, any ID that I get from this Teams regarding the channel or regarding users is a generated ID that Teams uses. It's not necessarily Azure Active Directory information, right? You get information about the user, but who that user is still up to you to determine. So if you, in the previous module on the Teams fundamentals, we talked about using a tab to authenticate and identify people using Azure Active Directory. You might need to combine these capabilities if you want to do authenticated requests to do the lookup, right? I don't have to authenticate between Teams and my Compose extension, but if my Compose extension is going to be querying data somewhere else, that authentication is fully the responsibility of the developer. Right? To help facilitate that little bit, when you respond to the query event, instead of providing a result, you can provide what they call an auth command. And that auth command would include a URL, and then the Teams application will pop up a dialog with that URL in which you can then initiate some type of login or token acquisition. Again, it's your responsibility to understand that when I get a response from this call and I get a token based on some UPN from Azure Active Directory, the Teams generated ID that I got for the user is not going to be the same. It's your responsibility to store that association. So again, if this is unfamiliar to you, I encourage you to go back and look at the fundamentals module and review the section on authenticating a Microsoft Graph to see how this authentication command can be leveraged. So let's do a demo on the Compose extensions. So in this demo, we're going to see how Compose extensions can help users find and reply information into a Microsoft Teams channel or one-on-one conversation. You see what we have now in our group conversation, Stanley has asked what SMS channel is supported by the bot framework. I've extended my bot to include a Compose extension that will look up the channels that are supported by the bot framework. So by clicking in the reply box, I can just type in information. But I don't, what my response is, I think for sure we have one that's supported SMS, but I'm not 100% sure. So I can click the ellipsis here and I choose Teams bot is in the list. When I choose that, I now get my Compose extension. I've defined a command parameter called prompt or to search, and it'll search the bot channels for me. So if I type in my search string here, as I fill that in, as soon as I pause typing, it makes an execute and it shows me, well, Twilio was supported, and I can choose that, and by choosing that, it now renders a card and posts the card directly in my Compose window. I can press send, and now I've responded to Stanley that, hey, the response is Twilio, and notice the information came from the Teams bot. So this is a Compose extension. I don't necessarily have to do this in a reply. I can do it in a new conversation down here. It shows up as well. Key difference here is I don't have to mention the bot to invoke the Compose extension. I can just use this Compose helper dialog here. So let's see how this code works in Visual Studio. My messages controller, again, this is our top level component that's handling the web API. This has been refactored a little bit now. Instead of an if message or an if statement for a different type or a system message, we're doing a switch statement on the activity type, and there's a type called invoke. And if the invoke activity is sent, I'm going to use this other helper to handle the invoke. Right? One thing I want to point out is a little bit different. In the past, when we were doing replying to a bot conversation, we can do this send method either as the part of the conversation object, or in my system messages I can do a similar thing where I'm actually replying back by sending something back through the channel. But when I'm doing a Compose extension, now I don't send the response back through the bot conversation channel. I actually need to send the response back as part of the HTTP response. So I've refactored this a little bit more to define a response object here, and then get that from my invoke handler and return it. So when I'm responding to a message in my bot, I will just do the bot channel response and return a 200 OK. But if I'm doing invoke, I need to actually include in the body of the response my method. So that's one little key thing to keep in mind there. Let's look at this method that handles the invoke. And again, we talked about how the Microsoft, the bot connector Teams extension has some helper methods for us here, including the stuff to parse the request and give us a strongly typed object. So in this particular example, I'm just defining what I'm expecting to get in my search command and my search text. And I do some validation. If I don't understand what is being sent to me, it's a wrong command ID, I'm just going to return a bad request message if it says it was not recognized, right? That's if it fails my validation. So that's what all this section is doing down here for validation. If I scroll down a little bit more, you'll see here I'm going to have a response, which is, again, this is a type of HTTP response that I'm going to set up. And here's where I start doing the work. I've just hard-coded a collection of data, and so we'll do this real quick here. If I go into this bot channels data, you'll see I just created a list of all the various channels that are supported by the bot framework. Obviously, you would want to do something a little bit more rich to talk out to a database, for example. But I do a search, and if I get some kind of results, I'm going to say what I'm going to return back to the bot, the compose extension response will be a thing called a result of type a layout list, right? So the type equals result is because here I actually results, I want you to render them. As I mentioned in the slide deck, the type could be auth, which would then say I need an authorization pop-up to handle. But for now, I'm sending just results, and those results are formatted or laid out in a list. Okay. And then for each item in my result set, I'm going to create a new thumbnail card, right, and add that to the list of attachments on this result that I'm sending back, right? And then I just return that as, in this particular case, I want to return that as string. So I have this result. I'm going to come back and say I want to convert it to a JSON object, and then it'll be rendered. I'm going to switch to the ngrok proxy so you can see the value that was sent to me. So here's my request comes in here, and you can see here I'm getting a search command, and the search text is SMS. That's the values that was sent to me by the teams. Further on, you can now see I can see who sent it. It's Paul, and here's the ID of Paul, right? And a certain conversation if I wanted to look up more about the team and channel. My response is a JSON object that has the compose extension, type result, and here's my card. So my content is a thumbnail card. It has the information, right, including a link off. So that's pretty straightforward HTTP response request stuff, a typical web API, which is a little bit normal for web API work, but different for a bot framework. Now, how did I get this command parameter, command name, how did all that to work? That's all part of the manifest. So we'll switch over to the manifest, and now I have these compose extensions. Looking through here, I need to associate my compose extension with a bot, so I have my bot ID. If I scroll further up when I have my bots, there's the bot ID there as well, and of course the whole app manifest ID is the same thing. So that number matches all along. That's saying, so for this particular bot, you know, when I hit the compose extension and I pop up that list of extensions, it needs to know to which endpoint to send it. That's how it's registered using the bot ID. I can specify whether I'm going to allow my compose extension in a conversation for a channel, which is the team scope, or in a personal scope, which is a one-on-one chat. Here is that update configuration setting. It's set to true. I didn't implement that at all, but it's set to true. So we'll go back and we'll see how that works. And now I have my commands. Here is my search command that is helping me understand what I expect to see. My command ID is search command. That should match. And then I have a parameter named search text, and of course I'm searching for that as well as part of my validation. Right? And then the rest of it is information is just shown is for the UI. It shows up in the UI. Lastly, you'll notice my initial run is set to false. When I invoked my compose extension, I had a blank window because initial run was set to false. I'm going to set initial run equal to true. And then I'm going to go into my compose helper, and when I do my search, my response here, I'm going to check to see, I'm looking to see, am I going to get my query parameter equals null. So let me just change this real quick because this will be null at the moment. I'm just going to check and make sure the command ID is not null. And if that's the case, right here where I do my, so we'll pause this out here. And then when I do my search right here, we'll do it real quick to see. Pull this out. And if on the initial run, it'll be empty. So if param then we'll just simply say, okay, we'll check this to say if this is not equal to null, then we can run our result here. We'll set this to be all at the beginning. And if I didn't, if if I get something here, we'll just result this to. So the idea here is that, what am I missing? There we go. So I'm going to start with all of them, but if I have a parameter, I'm going to then filter it. So this being a live demo, let's hope I did this correctly. The intent here now is that I'm saying initial run equals true, so we should do a call initially, right? So let's real quick, this may fail, so I'm going to set a breakpoint here. Next thing I need to do is I just change the manifest. So I need to return back to my team membership and go to the apps tab and re-upload or re-sideload my bot. No errors, we should be good. So I go back to the conversation and we'll invoke the compose dialog here and choose TeamsBot 2. It's loading, so initially the initial run said go ahead and work on it. It's doing the run and we're working. And we'll just swoop through here. So far so good. And I had some kind of failure. So not sure what I did wrong, but I think you understand the difference here. This obviously something didn't work right, but because I set the initial run equal to true, it was invoked right away instead of me waiting to have a list of items there. So that was a quick overview of how that would work. So again, stopping this now, going back to the manifest just to highlight here, we associate it with our particular bot. We define a scope. Oh, I should show the configuration example. Oh, sorry about that. So we'll load that again, and we'll go back into here, and we'll just close out of this. And now when I click here, when I choose TeamsBot 2, here's the ellipsis. I can do settings, and notice, well, it's still bolded up here, right? So now the invoke happened, but when the invoke is happening here, if I look at the activity, activity type is going, see, we still have invoke, right? And it's continue on. Oh, I still have my bug in my code. It's still not going to work. But again, settings, when I invoke the settings option here, it's going to make that separate call instead of query. There we go. All right, so it again is invoked my method, but what I would expect to see now is not the type of query, but rather the type of settings URL right here. So query setting URL. Again, I would need to respond to that in kind, which I'm not, so I'm still going to have an error. But the idea, of course, is by configuring this in the manifest, I can make that happen. Right? So that is the compose extensions help users find information and post it into the conversation. Moving on to the next section of our module, Microsoft Teams apps with multiple capabilities. First, we'll talk about one last capability that we can add to our Teams apps, and then which are connectors and webhooks, and then we'll have a discussion about combining multiple capabilities into a single Teams app. So webhooks is an industry term now that's generally described as letting disparate cloud services interact with each other by sending messages using HTTP protocol. When I have some type of external system and something happens in this external system and I want to notify people in my team, we've talked a little bit about in the context of doing this in a tab or perhaps in a bot, but what if I don't have those necessarily available? I just have some type of system and something happens. It's a daily report or it's an alert of some sort. I can send a message into a channel just like any other message using a text or cards or actionable cards. And when I post this message into the webhook, it then shows up as in my conversation. I register this endpoint in a couple different ways, and once I have this endpoint, again, I can just write code that does an HTTP post and sends the payload specified as a connector or payload, and it'll render it as we see it. It'll look very familiar to what we've seen so far. There are two ways to get these endpoints. One is what we call an incoming webhook, in which the incoming webhook just simply means I ask Microsoft Teams application to generate a URL, I copy that URL, and then I use that in my external systems to send data. The other approach is using the Office 365 connector framework, and the Office 365 connector framework allows for some automated flow to generate and capture this URL. I still, as a developer, I still need to capture that URL and store it and use it in my external systems, but I don't have to relate to copy-paste or remembering something displayed on a screen. It does have some programmatic flow. To fully utilize Office 365 connectors across the whole service, you would register them in the connector dashboard. However, that's not required to use those. You can get a connector registered and call it from a side-loaded app, so if it's something internal. And as well, you can do the incoming webhook without registration as well. So we'll cover all of those different scenarios. The connector can be added to the Microsoft Teams app via the manifest, right? So first step would be to go and register it, and as you register the Teams connector, you get some information, and it generates what's called a connector ID. And then I go back to my manifest, and I add the connectors section by putting a connector ID into the manifest, and I define the scope for that connector as well. Right? And as I put information in the registration panel, this connector ID is tied to that registration, so that when I'm using the Teams experience to add a connector, it will then show the information that I put in my registration. There's a little pop-up dialog so users understand what's going on here. So let's do a demo here. We'll talk about how to get this data from external systems, both via the incoming webhook and generating a side-loaded connector. In this demo, we're going to walk through the steps for incoming webhook as well as a Teams connector. So in my team, I've created a new channel for information from my external system. Although it's not necessarily required, I find it a little simple to separate information specific to an application into its own channel. In that channel, I'm going to click on the connectors context menu item, which lets me register a connector. There are a lot of pre-configured connectors from various web services. I'm going to just use incoming webhook for the moment. I then see the consent dialog. It lists all the values, all the various capabilities that will be allowed by this webhook. And me as the team owner need to make sure that I'm comfortable with all these actions, and then click add. This takes me to the create form. I can give it a name. I'm just going to call it a manual webhook for the moment, not to distinguish it from one I'll create in the future. And click the create button. This will then generate a URL. This URL is what's used to send messages to incoming webhook messages. So I'm going to click done, and that will then add to the list of configured connectors. And I'll close this dialog, and you can see in the channel there is a message posted. By the way, Paul has configured this. So now I have my URL. I'm going to just fill this in a little PowerShell script that I have at the moment. Next, if I'm going to be sending a message through an incoming webhook, I need to have the message text, what we call a payload. I can do text, I can do cards. We've provided a sample card. I'm going to copy this, and then we'll switch to a website that Microsoft has called the Message Card Playground. And in the Message Card Playground, I'll paste that information. Let me try that again. There we go. And so by filling out the various JSON objects here, I can then get a preview of what the card will look like. Obviously, Monday, May 1st is not going to work for us in so let's go with Tuesday, May 2nd. And you can see, as I typed the value in here, it reflected directly in the preview. So once I'm comfortable with this, I can make sure I can use this as my payload. Again, it's a JSON object. Now, so I've got my payload, I've got my URL. The next thing is to make an HTTP post to that URL. And so that's where we have this PowerShell script that's provided in the step-by-step labs. First, I'm going to read the JSON from the file and store it in a variable. Then I have my URLs. You'll notice here it's webhook, and there's a bunch of GUIDs in here with an @ sign. And so you can see it's not something that's easily discoverable. But again, anyone who has this URL can make messages and show up in this channel. And then lastly, we do this invoke REST method, which is a PowerShell statement. We're going to be sending application/JSON. We're going to include the message body at a certain URL and run the post. So this being all set here, I should be able to just run this. I'm going to run them individually so that you can see the results a little simpler. And then lastly, the invoke. And this actually runs the message. Now, what the result here is going to look a little bit different. We see just a 1. 1 means it worked, right? That's all that the invoke REST method is going to do. When I make a post to this web service, the Outlook, .office.com/webhook, the response is simply a 1. So that's all it's echoed back, right? But if I go back to the Teams, you'll notice now the manual webhook has posted in the channel the same value of the card, right? So this is our incoming webhook capability, and this works just fine. Again, the key part here is you have information formatted as a card, you have the URL of the webhook, and you can make a HTTP post request, and that will just work. However, that's not necessarily very scalable. It may work for one-offs, or it may work for system activities that work, but perhaps you want to have something that's available through all the teams and all the channels in your organization, and you want to allow users to add that without having to write HTTP method requests. And that's where we use the Office 365 connector framework along with our bot. So to do that, before we can do that, we have to have some type of registration. So there is a connector registration site. So I've preloaded that here in my developer thing here. I have fill out a form where I have a Teams connector, and I can upload a logo if I wish, provide some basic information, and then you'll notice I have a URL that I have to post to. Notice I still have my tunnel running with that URL, so it's accessible, right? What I need to provide in here is, do I want to, in addition to just having general information that's displayed during registration, I can go through and say, do I want to enable actions, yes or no? And if I do want to have actions, I need to have these HTTPS URLs. Right? These, again, get registered as part of that consent dialog. Right? And then I want to go through and say, what is it, landing page? So when I want to do this registration, then people will go through a little wizard experience, and as part of the wizarding experience, we want to make sure we let them land on a page that shows information that helps explain why we want a connector, or what information we're going to be providing. Further down, I then enable an integration for Outlook, Inbox, Outlook Groups, or Microsoft Teams. Right? And so you'll notice what I've checked out of the requirements for using it in Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams build upon the group, so I need to check the group as well as Microsoft Teams. I've left the inbox option off. So what I end up with here are, after saving this, it will refresh and give me these buttons that I need to do. I need to copy this code, and I need to download this manifest, and we'll talk about what those are. So when I copy the code, what I get is a very long URL, which does not look familiar, but it's an anchor tag with this URL, and you'll notice here it's a connector and passing in some values, including what's called an app ID, right, and a callback URL, which happens to match the values that I specified here. Okay. Right? And that the text that's displayed inside that anchor tag is an image that says connect to Office 365. So I'm going to need that HTML later, so we leave that in the clipboard. In addition, I have a manifest, and if I've already pre-downloaded that, and I look at that manifest, you'll see here this is a Teams manifest as we've seen before, and it has the connectors stuff filled out. And you'll notice I have a connector ID, which is going to match the information that I would have expected to see in my it's in this URL as well, right? So that's the information I need to register my Teams connector. Right? So that's step one. Now I need, in this part of this registration, we've actually provided some URLs. Well, I need to support what those do, right? So we're going to extend our bot by adding a connector to that. So I'm back in my Visual Studio for my bot 2, and now I have the manifest open, and so here's my connector section, which is empty. And I'm going to get that downloaded manifest in the connectors section there, and I'm going to replace what I have with that. So let's make sure I've got this all together. Yep. And so we'll replace our connectors with that. So now we've identified that particular connector with this bot. Right? Now I also am going to be adding some new information here, right? And so if I go back to my web config, you see I have my route for controller. All right, and so I'm going to make sure that this is set up to have 2 different controllers, so that we're set up here, the default, optional. Okay, nothing to do here. Let's add a new controller. I'm going to choose a Web API 2 controller empty, and I'm going to call this connector controller. So part of what we registered was a landing page. So I need to have a method that will respond to the landing page. So let's choose that. And we'll come in our connector here and create a method called landing. We have some cleanup to do here, as we'll do those real quick. Now, this is my landing page, and notice this has setting up a connector, and it's going to add this information, and it's click the button. Now, if you notice, this here is the link, right? I'm going to go through and delete this from my sample code, and I'm going to go back to what I copied from the connector portal and paste that in so that I'm using the correct URL. And I think I copied a little too much there because I just need to close the A tag. So we'll come back here and we'll do that. And I have totally messed that up, so let's try that again. So all I need is the URL. Delete that. We'll go back to our notepad. And I start with the URL, which is here. There we go. Okay, so I have my landing page. Notice the landing page has a callback URL, which is what's called a redirect page. So I need to have a redirect method in here as well. So let's create that. So the landing page is just going to show some HTML. It's just simply showing a page with a button. When I click the button, I'm going to go to the connector page, and it's going to do a callback to my redirect here. Again, we're missing some using, so let's fix those up. And when it comes back to the redirect page, I'm going to be getting information. What I'll be getting is the webhook URL back from the service, as well as the group name and those information here. A couple things to point out. There's a state value that is sent to the service here. So if I scroll over here, is the state equals my app state. What's returned to me should be the same value. So if this was production, you'd want to validate that the message you get back is the same state that you did. And then I get the webhook URL. Now, in my example, I'm simply going to show that information. I'm not going to actually store it in some type of external system, but that's what you would typically want to take this webhook URL along with the group name and store that somewhere so that you know when I want to send information to group external systems that I know what the webhook URL would be. Right? So having added all that to my bot, I'm going to start this again, make sure it's running. When I do this, it's going to rebuild the application manifest for me, or the application package. And so I need to come back to Teams and update and re-sideload. So I'll go back to Manage Team. Notice I have two things loaded here, my Teams bot as well as the incoming webhook. I'm going to update the team bot. So that's red, I get no errors, we should be good to go. So now if I go back to external systems and again and choose this connectors list, we still have our incoming webhook defined, but I want to add a new one. However, I didn't go through the entire publish process. If I look back on the connector process all the way at the top, there's an option for me to publish it to the store. When I publish it to the store, there's a review process that happens to verify that I am an actual person and I have good intentions, and there's some terms of use and some accountability behind it. However, I'm just doing development. I don't want to go through all that publishing yet. And so in my Teams application, I can scroll all the way down to the bottom and I will see side-loaded connectors. And there's my Teams connector. You'll notice it's got the blue icon instead of the green that we've been seeing all along, because in the app registration, I had the blue icon. So I'm going to click configure on that, and you'll see I get this dialog. It's similar to the consent one that we saw before. By the way, you have this Teams connector. This is that URL that I registered in my registration, right? And I said I wanted to do notifications. That's what the capabilities that I registered for. I'm going to go back to the registration portal here. You can see there's the blue. I said I'm going to sign up to do the actions that I'm going to do are called notification. That's what I put in here. I can type in whatever I'd like here, and that's what's going to show up. And then it gives me the option to visit the site to install. And when I get to the visit, so now I've landed at my landing page. And so, again, this is a page that I've created. It's hosted inside the Teams iframe. I didn't put any styling in it. You would certainly want to do more on that, but I can click the button to initiate the registration and consent flow. So I click Connect to Office 365 here. It now processes it worked, and it's given back to me, by the way, here is your app type. It's a Teams app, right? Here's the group, right? Here's the group identifier at the state, and here's my webhook URL. So I'm going to choose this webhook URL, and I'm going to copy that. And if we switch back over to our PowerShell, and we'll just change this, we'll add this in here. So and we'll update that, change my URL, re-invoke the same REST method now as we did before. I got number one again. If I switch back to Teams now, so first of all, I'm going to close that dialog, and we'll come back here and we'll say done here. And now if I close this, we now see that before we had manual webhook posted my card, but if you look further down now, I have my Teams connector that posted that card. So at the end of the day, it's the same process. I have a different card or different URL. The purpose for getting that URL is a little bit different, right? So I can programmatically capture that as part of the HTTP response if I am so inclined, and work on it that way. So revisiting our concept of having a single team app with multiple capabilities. As we showed before, a Teams app can contain tabs, it can contain cards, it can contain bots, compose extensions. And as you've seen as we've gone through this module, we've just added different pieces to the existing bot framework, different application. Now I didn't have tabs in there, but we can certainly include that HTML stuff in part of that as well. And it's all done using the manifest, right? So if we look back at our manifest, we have top level nodes for the configurable tabs, static tabs, bots, connectors, compose extensions, and you pick and choose the pieces that you need to provide a nice comprehensive experience. You are not required to use all of them. You can, again, just pick the ones you want. But by using a single package with the same icons and same names and everything, you just get a sense of familiarity with your integration from your line of business system or your external systems into Microsoft Teams. And you have one application, makes for easy deployment. It's a simple zip file to upload into a team or publish it into the store. Again, the easiest way to do that. So that concludes this module on Microsoft Teams Advanced Capabilities. I hope you found it helpful. Thank you.